If the temperature anomalies don't stabilize by this August, when we're expected to have the La Nina conditions emerge, then the world will be in uncharted territory.
Wow.
Those are the exact words.
So,
And that means that, so the uncharted territory, that means that like our climate system as we know it has been fundamentally altered much sooner than we expected.
welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on the news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson, and today it's time to talk about all this heat. This has been a year of record temperatures across the globe. According to the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, June 2024 was the warmest June on record and the 13th consecutive month of record high temperatures. This follows news from the Copernicus Climate Change Service earlier this year that we recently experienced a 12-month period in which every month was at least 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial temperatures. That's significant not just because it felt a little hotter for all of us, but because climate scientists have identified 1.5 degrees Celsius as a critical global warming threshold to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean the fight against climate change is lost. But the extreme heat impacting billions of people this summer is providing a preview of what might lie ahead if we don't take aggressive action. Joining me today to talk about all of this is Dr. Stephanie Rowe, WWF's Global Climate and Energy Lead Scientist. Stephanie will tell us what the science says about these extreme heat waves, what recent trends might mean for the years ahead, and what we need to do both locally and globally to prepare for continued climate extremes while also striving to prevent even worse outcomes. As always, please be sure to rate and subscribe to our feed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your podcast app of choice. And now, here's my conversation with Stephanie. All right, I am joined now by Dr. Stephanie Rowe. Stephanie, welcome back to Nature Breaking. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Seth. It's good to be back, although it's always some kind of bad news story back here. So hopefully next time it'll be good news.
That does seem to be the case. Yeah, we'll get you in on some good news in the coming months too. But for today, I think this is a timely conversation. This issue of heat waves is really on a lot of people's minds. We're all living through it in a lot of different parts of the world right now. And in my intro, I gave a quick summary of some of the heat records we've been setting this year. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. right now as we record this. It's projected to be 102 degrees today here. The heat index will be even higher. I'm sure we'll break a temperature record for this day in history in the D.C. area. We've seen new temperature records exceeding 120 degrees from Palm Springs, California to Delhi, India over the last couple months. And I wanted to ask you, as a climate scientist, do these heat emergencies surprise you, or is this on par with what the climate science has been telling us to expect?
Well, it's actually a little bit of both. So it's not surprising that we're continuing to break record after record. The science has been clear that climate change is making and will continue to make extreme weather events worse and more frequent. And climate impacts are already here and are being felt all across the planet, like you just said, and it's inflicting damage on our health and our well-being, our economy, as well as our natural ecosystems. And, it's projected that these extreme events will get worse with every fraction of a degree of additional warming. Now, on the other hand, the extent of the warming on land, and especially in the ocean over the last year, really blew past expectations and surprised many in the scientific community. 2023 was perhaps the warmest in the past 100,000 years, which is wild if you think about that. And even taking into account the El Nino effect, which tends to increase global temperatures by about 1 to 2 tenths of a degree, the planet warmed by about 0.2 degrees Celsius more than what scientists were predicting.
Yeah, and I know that sounds, what's 0.2 degrees to any of us, but cumulatively over the globe and the way that impacts habitats and local heat conditions is a really big deal, right?
Right, exactly. It might seem like a small fraction of a degree of warming, but it's the global average temperature compared to pre-industrial. And so on land, some of that additional warming is up to 8 degrees, for example.
Yeah.
So it's quite a lot.
Yeah. And do we know yet if climate change is primarily to blame for this year's and last year's run of extreme weather? Or you just mentioned El Nino. Are there other factors or even just plain bad luck that might be driving some of this?
Yeah, and again, it's kind of all of the above. So we know that climate change is the primary driver of temperature increases right now. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, for example, and deforestation has increased global temperatures to about 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. We've also had an El Nino event since last summer.
Mm-hmm.
And when El Nino is layered on top of an already warming world, it really supercharges extreme temperatures and weather. But like I said before, global temperatures in the last year have been much higher than what scientists have predicted. And there are various theories to explain this gap between the observed temperatures and the projected temperatures. And one of those theories is the reduction in aerosols or the particles from pollution in the atmosphere due to certain policies that have been instituted. And those aerosols have a cooling effect. And so some people think that that could be what it is, but in fact, none of the theories can actually fully explain the anomaly or the gap that we're seeing, which is quite worrying. And El Nino conditions are expected to actually swing to La Nina conditions by the end of the summer, which should bring temperatures down and hopefully more within kind of normal anomaly ranges. And actually, I was reading an article recently by Gavin Schmidt, who's the director of NASA Goddard. He published an article a couple months ago saying that if the temperature anomalies don't stabilize by this August, when we're expected to have the La Nina conditions emerge, then the world will be in uncharted territory.
Wow.
Those are the exact words. And that means that, so the uncharted territory, that means that like our climate system as we know it has been fundamentally altered much sooner than we expected.
So we're recording this in mid-July. This episode will be out in a week. You're talking about a month from now. By August of 2024, or should I say the end of August 2024, if things don't start to even out a little more, then we should really start to get more worried.
Yes, exactly. And we really need to figure out what is causing all of that additional warming.
Yeah. Wow, that is scary stuff. And I hate to even ask this as a follow-up, but how much worse can we expect these extreme heat trends to get if things don't even out in August, or if we fail to do the things we need to do to act on climate change?
Well, as I mentioned before, extreme events will get worse with every fraction of a degree of additional warming. But it's important to also understand that the relationship between warming and the impacts caused by that warming is not linear. So every fraction of a degree of warming doesn't actually produce an equal amount of extreme events, for example, or heat waves. Also, we don't know the exact temperature thresholds for certain impacts and tipping points, which could cause, really sudden and severe damage. And so really to avoid the worst impacts, we need to peak and then reduce emissions as soon and as fast as possible.
Yeah, I know global governments have made commitments to try to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The U.S. And many other nations have made pledges to cut emissions by 50% by 2030. That's really the most important thing we need to do, absolutely. How are we doing on that front? Are emissions still going up? Are they starting to come down? Where do things stand in the global effort to actually reduce emissions to get at this underlying issue?
Well, unfortunately, in 2023, global emissions, which is led by fossil fuel emissions, continued to grow. And that's obviously very worrying because we really need them to peak and decline as soon as possible. But there are some positive signs, including, for example, the rapid scale up of renewable energy and electrified transport. And that's mostly due to reducing costs and also policies that are helping scale up these technologies. And the scale up of those technologies are actually exceeding projections. And because of those trends, some scientists are predicting that global emissions will peak this year in 2024 or in 2025 and decline after.
Yeah.
But of course, all of that depends on a favorable political and economic environment. And the EU just had their elections, which seems to be favorable to addressing climate change. So all eyes right now are on the U.S. election, which are going to have huge implications on the growth or decline of fossil fuel emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point, and something I know we're all going to be watching closely over the next few months. Maybe we can talk again in 4 or 5 months and see where things stand and what that might imply for the future. So kind of pivoting off of that topic of emission reduction, there's another wrinkle to this, right? That option one with a bullet is always we need to reduce emissions as quickly and as much as possible. But there's also been a lot of talk in recent years about carbon removal, and you recently served as a lead author on a report about the state of carbon removal. So I'd love to ask you to tell us a little bit about that report and what it says about the role that carbon removal could play in meeting our climate goals. And I should probably say carbon removal, what we're talking about is, if we can't stop emitting emissions fast enough, then we might need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to help bring temperatures down. So tell us a little bit about that report and what you found.
Yeah, sure. And also just to give a bit more context, so carbon dioxide removal, sometimes called CDR for short, is a human activity that captures CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it for decades to millennia in either the biosphere or in geological storage. And it was clear that, and even with the amount of emission reductions that we need, it's clear that to limit warming to 1.5 degree or well below 2 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement goal, we need to not only reduce GHG emissions, and like you said, by about 50% by 2030, for example, until we get to net zero. But to get to net zero, which is a balance of CO2 sources and sinks, we also need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And in the report, what we find is that we are already removing about 2 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, primarily through conventional approaches like afforestation, reforestation, and soil carbon management. There are also more novel approaches coming up like biochar, direct air capture and sequestration, and enhanced weathering of rocks. But so we do have, that 2 billion tons of CO2 that we're removing right now, but we need an additional about 5 to 7 billion tons per year of CDR by 2050. And not only do we need to do that, but we need to do it in a way that is sustainable and doesn't negatively affect, of course, the health of people and our ecosystems. And so that's going to be a huge task, which is going to require really smart innovations and policies to help propel that forward.
Yeah. So that projection in terms of the amount of CDR we're going to need is based on current projections for the amount of emissions that we're on track to reduce, and then you basically identify a gap and you're figuring out what that gap is and what role CDR needs to play. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's directly proportional to the amount of emissions that we are able to achieve, or emission reductions, that we're able to achieve. However, it needs to be made very clear that you cannot conflate emission reductions with removals. Removals are very difficult, very expensive to do. So it's just like an oil spill. It's it's a lot easier and more cost effective to avoid an oil spill rather than to have to clean it up afterwards. And so we know that there are what's called residual emissions, which are very hard to abate emissions. So for example, emissions from cement or industrial processes, or for example, livestock and agriculture that emit methane and nitrous oxide, that are very difficult to reduce down to zero. So we are going to have an amount of residual emissions that we are going to need to compensate with carbon dioxide removal. So carbon dioxide removal should not be used for the emission reductions that we can actually reduce. So for example, the emissions from our power sector that we can easily reduce through the deployment of renewable energy, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to think about it, and thank you for breaking it down that way. So I want to bring this back to, these heat waves that so many of us are experiencing in the last couple months, and I want to give people some practical advice because climate change is this big global issue. I think there's a sense a lot of people have that there's nothing they can do to make a difference, and whether it's heat waves or extreme weather events like hurricanes, there's a feeling of just kind of having to live through it, and you're just along for the ride and there's nothing you can do. But there are still some steps that either individual people or people within their cities and towns and communities can take to lower emissions or to minimize impacts from extreme heat and other climate outcomes. So I'll split that into two questions for you. And first, I'll just ask, what can we do at the local or individual level to limit emissions?
Yeah, it's really easy to get complacent, and I want to be clear that there's so much that we can do, and I would categorize the way that we can make an impact into two things. One are the things that we can do ourselves, and then the others are the things that we can do to influence others.
Yeah.
And so individual actions, the things that we can do ourselves, include things like adopting healthier, more sustainable diets, reducing our waste and overall consumption, choosing low emission energy sources in transportation. So for example, walking, biking, taking public transportation, switching to an electric car, and also using energy efficient building materials, appliances, and technology. But of course, we can only make those choices if they're available to us. And also, to make meaningful progress, we really need to fundamentally transform our energy, transportation, and food systems. So we really need a whole of society, in particular governments and companies, to act companies and governments at all levels. So, all the way from the local to the national levels to act. And to get there, that's the second part, which is, our ability to influence others. And I would say that, the best way, and a lot of the science on climate communications, is to talk about it. So we need to talk about it with our friends, with our colleagues, with our decision makers. The evidence shows that people listen to the people who are closest to them. Yeah. Right. And so to be able to talk about it with our friends and our colleagues is really important. Make it a priority for you, but also push for it to be a priority for your friends and family to vote, to make climate change a priority for your vote in this year's election, for example. Talk about, in terms of decision makers, talk about it with your, building manager or neighbor council to see what improvements can be made, at that very local level where you live. Or talk about it with the businesses you frequent to push for more ambitious action, for example.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to phrase it, because we're all having these conversations right now. Every conversation I feel like I have, whether I'm getting in a taxi to go somewhere and talking to a stranger, or just like walking around my office building today and talking to colleagues, the first thing everyone says is, "Can you believe how hot it is? What about this weather, huh?" And, to make sure that you follow on in that conversation and not just say, "Oh, I can't believe how hot it is." Say, this is the reality that climate change is bringing to us, and we need to get serious about addressing it to make sure that this doesn't keep getting worse and spiraling. And I'll just put in a plug for, on the individual level, one thing that at least anyone who's a homeowner can do, that I did myself over this last winter, is you can get a home energy audit. And there's a federal U.S. government tax credit to get a home energy audit now through the Inflation Reduction Act, that you can have a home energy expert come to your home, do an evaluation, see what improvements you can make to lower your heating and cooling bills, at the same time lower your emissions as well. And take actions accordingly. So I found it very helpful to have sort of a plan put together for my household, and that's something that anyone can do. I'll put a link in the show notes for the federal website that people can look at to get more information.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point, because there's a lot of incentives out there to not only just do that audit, but then once they identify the things that you can do, for example, you might switch from a boiler to a heat pump or something like that, that there are incentives and tax credits available to be able to reduce those costs as well. And so it's available to everyone. I mean, I would say the same thing with electric vehicles. There's a lot of incentives out there to look into. So that's a great plug, Seth.
Definitely. So pivoting away from emissions, the other side of this question that I posed at the beginning is, in terms of people taking action in their own world, the other side of this is, what can we do at an individual or local level to actually adapt to or minimize the effects of this heat or other impacts of climate change? What can we all do on that side of things?
Well, all climate impacts and therefore all adaptation is local, right? And there's a long list of things that can be done to adapt or reduce the impacts of climate change depending on where you live and depending on whether you live in coastal regions or whether you live inland, whether you live in drylands or wetlands. And I would want to highlight nature-based solutions here as providing some really good options for helping to increase resiliency and minimize the effects of climate change. So those nature-based solutions is essentially using nature to be able to address a variety of global challenges, including climate adaptation and mitigation. So one of them could be, for example, adding trees and perennial vegetation, which could help reduce heat and improve drainage, for example. Also, in coastal wetlands, protecting and restoring them could reduce the risks of flooding and storm surge. And in fact, I've turned my backyard from a lawn. I have about half a hectare of land that used to be all lawn, and now it's almost all woodland or perennial garden. And not only does it help cool the area, it also provides this wonderful ecosystem for birds and pollinators, which also increases their resilience to climate change.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of those types of examples that I love.
Yeah, that's great. Our colleague Carlos Clausel, who I interviewed last month on this podcast, just published a great piece in Time this week or last week about the cooling effect of trees in urban areas and how advocating within your community to build more forest cover in urban areas or just like local park tree coverage can really make a difference of a few degrees in terms of your neighborhood versus the next neighborhood over. And that can really be like a lifesaver on these extreme heat days. So
absolutely. And also, forests, going outside of urban areas, forests help increase the resilience of your water supply.
Yeah.
Which is huge when you're talking about climate impacts. Climate impacts is really heat and then extreme weather events, buffering you from extreme weather events, and then also the availability of food and water.
Yep.
So being able to increase resilience on those things would be the priority.
Yep. Well, I think those are really good actionable steps that people can take, and I really wanted to touch on those points because I don't want to just have a conversation about how hot it is and how frustrated we all are about how climate change is advancing. I really wanted to at least give people some attainable steps that they could pursue to make a difference on this as well. But my last question for you today is this: as a climate scientist who thinks about this stuff for a living, what's your message for people who may just now be developing more of an awareness about climate change due to these heat waves? What would you want them to know?
Oof. Yeah, I think about that sometimes in terms of people that are just getting aware, and those include my children, for example, right? But then also maybe people who are just getting more and more familiar with this topic. What I will say is that climate change will impact every single human, animal, plant, and ecosystem on the planet. It is just a super pervasive challenge that we have on our hands. And the records that we keep on breaking on temperatures, on extreme events, on economic damage and die-offs of ecosystems and species, they are all alarm bells that we need to listen to. And climate change is a global problem that requires a global solution, but we also have a lot more agency than we think to be able to push for those global solutions. And so I just would go back to what we discussed earlier is, we need to talk about it. We need to push our decision makers to act. And that's all across. People focus on national politics. And in fact, making a difference on climate change is at all levels, from our landlords to our schools, to our employers, to our city, state, national governments, the businesses we buy goods and services from. So the more we talk about it, but in a positive way to shift towards solutions, I think the better. And And I would just end with this in terms of what you should know is that acting on climate change is going to reduce the costs in the future, because people talk about, oh, but addressing climate change is too expensive. The impacts and the economic damage from future climate change is going to be so astronomical that doing it now is going to be much more cost effective. And then also that being able to address it now has many other co-benefits, including, for example, dramatically reducing air pollution and increasing our air quality, which would dramatically also improve health outcomes for people that live in cities. And so there's a lot of these things that we can think about that can provide significant benefits to our health. I mean, think about the corals, for example, being able to survive in a planet where we can limit warming. There are many other benefits to addressing climate change than just lowering temperatures. And so we really need to provide agency to more and more people that they can act.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining the show today. I really appreciate your time and your insights in this moment when so much of our individual attention is turning to climate change and climate impacts. It's really great to hear from a true expert like yourself. So thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure, Seth. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again to Stephanie for joining the show today. This summer, it really feels like climate extremes are all around us, so I think it's more important than ever to hear from experts like Stephanie who can both ground our experiences in hard science to explain what's happening, but who can also give us clear guidance about how we can make a difference. I hope you'll all take Stephanie's words to heart in the coming weeks and think about your own contributions to climate change, and also have those conversations in your communities about the role that climate change plays in the extreme heat and other impacts that we're all feeling. Thanks for listening, and together, let's keep building a more sustainable future.